All right, welcome to chapter 14. We are in the home stretch of this course with just 3 weeks left to go. This is the final chapter of this module, and today we're going to be discussing prison life, both living in the prison and leaving the prison. Specifically, we're going to look at problems within the correction systems. We're going to look at what total institution means. We're going to look at prisonization, or the concept of it. We're going to talk about the lives and the cultures of inmates while they're incarcerated. We'll talk a little bit about prison violence. We'll talk about correctional treatment, the officers who manage and operate these facilities, and then we'll close out with prisoners' rights and difficulties related to reentry. Some of the biggest problems with our adult correctional systems have to do with the fact that for years, policymakers had a heavy reliance on incarceration for deterrence and incapacitation. Today, there are 1,700 prisons that are in operation as a consequence of that policy. In 1979, there were 568, which should explain a great deal about what our tough on crime policies have done. While they've made our streets arguably safer, there's certainly the argument to be made that we have massively increased our incarceration system. The majority of these prisons that are in existence today are medium security. They're holding primarily nonviolent offenders, and most are operating at complete capacity, complete inmate capacity, while understaffed of officers. The phrase total institution describes a regimented or dehumanizing institution, such as a prison, in which like situated people, in this case meaning convicts, are kept in social isolation and cut out from the world at large. So breaking that definition back down means that we have a facility that is full of people who have been convicted of crimes that were an offense to society, and they're required to remain together and kept away from the rest of the world. Most normal functions of everyday life are prohibited or are limited. These people who are incarcerated face a loss of their own personal possessions. Bare minimum services are typically provided, such as food and medical services. Only what's necessary is what's given to them. The concept of individualism is strictly monitored, and it's often suppressed to maintain order within these facilities. Many times, inmates display difficulty conforming, especially if this is the first time that they've entered a facility. And within groups, we see social codes that are developed and exercised on a regular basis. Prisonization, another way to refer to prisonization is to say that someone has been institutionalized, meaning that they fail to function in society and only find the possibility of thriving in a prison-style environment. These people have fully assimilated into the subculture within prisons. Acceptance into these subcultures is dictated by both the offender's attitude and what crime it is they've been convicted of. Racial divides within prisons are very prevalent and remain that way today. Gang affiliations also remain strong inside these prison walls. In fact, in systems such as the Kansas Department of Corrections, you will find some of our most notable gangs are separated by facility to keep miles of separation between these groups. These cultures are not limited to male prisoners. These similar cultures exist within female prisons. Even though female prisons are typically less violent, those subcultures exist. Those gang tendencies exist. One facet of female facilities that we don't necessarily see in male facilities is the concept of faux families become an adaptation in female facilities, in which someone acts as a husband and or a father to other inmates. Someone acts as a spouse or a mother to other inmates in order to remain together in an attempt to keep each other safe. Prisons are violent places. About every year, 90 inmates are killed by other inmates, and there are about 250 suicides committed in prisons across the country each year. These victims are typically younger, violent offenders who are failing to find success within the prison system, who are failing to assimilate into a culture, and are acting out and either become victims themselves or end up taking their own lives. Collective violence is a concern for prison staff. This typically involves revolts or riots, and they're directed at policies related to prison operations that inmates are not accepting. Um, Riots don't happen very often, but when they do, it's very concerning and extremely disruptive to operational staff. You usually see high turnover rates within corrections officers after an event like that has occurred, especially if there was an officer who got hurt in the process. Sexual violence is, of course, a concern within any facility. There's no specific facet, meaning it's as prevalent in male prisons as it is in female prisons, and this is inmate on inmate sexual violence. It's staff on inmate sexual violence, and with the development within the last 20 years of females working in male prisons, inmate on staff sexual violence as well. Prisons have more roles to perform than simply keeping people behind walls. In other words, corrections officers don't simply work to ensure the security of the facility and that no one walks away. Prisons have a job to do, and rehabilitation is one of those goals. So there are services that are provided behind those walls to help with that rehabilitation process. Individual and group counseling is available that focuses on cognitive therapies, helping inmates handle emotional control, develop social skills, and even some problem solving tasks are put in place. Sometimes this is done through work efforts, other times it's simply done through counseling. There are faith based programs that are prevalent in just about any facility, and inmates involved in faith based programs tend to show lower recidivism rates than those who focus only on those secular programs that are made available to them. Drug treatment programs have existed for decades in all prisons because almost all inmates at one point or another were prone to substance abuse, and it makes that connection or that nexus related to their crimes that much more prevalent, and it also impacts recidivism rates. So I'm not aware of a facility in the country who does not offer some type of drug treatment program. And then, of course, educational and vocational programs, they help provide a distraction for those who are spending significant amounts of time behind bars, and it also aids them in skill building to be able to become resourceful in the private sector world once they've been released from custody. Let's talk about officers. As I mentioned before, correctional officers have numerous tasks. Their primary purpose is to control the inmate population and the prison operations. However, that's very, very complex. Um, Many of their daily operations revolve around operational requirements such as transporting inmates to different appointments, to different facilities, etc. And almost all of them have a security driven nexus associated with it. It's not as simple as putting someone in a car and taking them to the doctor's office and bringing them back. There are always steps involved regarding securing a prisoner safely, regarding searching a prisoner to prevent the introduction of contraband into the facility. It's always a more involved task than what we would experience at home. While they're maintaining order, these officers are also advocating for rehabilitation. These guys become the cheerleaders for these inmates who are successfully completing programs while they're behind bars. It's their job to encourage them to find success inside the walls so that they never have to return. Sometimes that's a difficult task because at the same time you're encouraging them to find success, you are enforcing rules of the facility, and sometimes that means doling out punishment. We're beginning to see more female correctional officers within facilities. There was a Supreme Court case, and I'll let you find it in the chapter in your text, that relates to whether or not female officers can be prevented from working in male facilities. The census of the court was essentially they cannot. It does make things a more dangerous environment. Remember, this is a facility that's potentially filled with violent male offenders who are stronger, more powerful, and have greater physical abilities than their female officers supervising them do. So it does make it an especially touchy subject, especially in all male facilities. Just because someone has been sent to prison does not mean that they have lost all of their constitutional rights. For a long period of time, there was the hands-off doctrine that lived within the walls of almost every prison, and that was at the federal and at the state level, in which policymakers had determined that prison administrators were free to run their facilities as they saw fit, provided as there was not a lot of problems coming from the facility. No one really paid much attention. Today, standards have been developed related to operations that are pretty well followed nationwide. And almost every large scale facility follows what's called legal based procedures, meaning they have brought experts in and have studied existing case law, previous case law, and on a yearly basis stay up to case law related to caring for and the treatment of inmates. And they develop policies that keep them in line with any decisions the courts have made. There's a very specific reason for this, and it's lawsuit prevention. Prisoners can sue a prison while they are being incarcerated if they can bring a case to show that their constitutional rights have been violated. The same occurs at the county jail. I myself have been called into court on 2 different lawsuits on the treatment of inmates. Now, their cases were unfounded and they never went anywhere, but it's certainly an unnerving effect to have a summons served on you because an inmate is upset over the way they're being treated within their facility. Some of the constitutional rights that inmates get to preserve are that they still retain access to the courts. Even in prison, they cannot be prevented from addressing the court related to their case or any other case. They retain the right to their freedom of expression, to their freedom of religion. They retain medical rights. Inmates have the right to medical care, and if they are ill or ailing, those prison systems have an obligation to ensure that they are treated and treated appropriately. They have the right to be free from cruel punishment, meaning prisons cannot develop policies and penalties associated with violating those policies that are excessively harsh. So when we see prison-related movies such as The Longest Yard, where Adam Sandler was put in a steel box in the blazing sun for 3 days, that is not something that would ever occur in a real facility. Inmates also have the right to be free from physical abuse. That abuse can come from another inmate. That abuse can come from staff. They have the right to feel safe within the prison walls, which is a tougher challenge than simply putting the expression on paper. 90% of inmates entering a prison system are going to be released at some point. It may be over decades. It may be over a shorter period of time, such as 6.5 years, I believe is what we've shown before is the average. However, there are very, very few cases that exist today in which an inmate being booked into a prison system is going to spend the rest of his or her life there. Most inmates will leave the prison at some point via parole. The courts have shown us that there's no absolute right to parole. However, though inmates are granted the right to a parole hearing when their time is due. That hearing satisfies due process, and if that parole board determines it is not an appropriate time to release this person, due process has been satisfied, and the inmate has no right to an appeal at that point. Presuming that they are released on parole, intensive supervision is the standard immediately after release. Those probation officers or those supervision officers keep a tight grip on those who've been incarcerated in prison and have just immediately been released. Often it's checking in with a parole officer, sometimes every 48 hours, and then slowly over time, their reporting requirements are drawn further and further out as they display their ability to conform to the rules that are placed on top of them. Those rules change also based on performance. If there are other programs that that convict has been required to complete, the more programs they complete successfully, the longer that leash is let out while they're being supervised on parole. Several factors are problematic for inmates attempting to re-enter society and not have to go back to prison. And it's almost in some circumstances as if the deck has been stacked against them, and it's almost predictable who does and does not come back. That the factors that influence that are an inmate's prison experiences. What was that experience like? Did they assimilate into the culture? Did they build and bond with a peer group within that prison culture? And do they long for that more than they ever would working in a free society? Oftentimes, these inmates find the supervision requirements to be too stringent, it becomes too difficult to keep up with everything that their parole officer is asking them to do while they're out seeking to accomplish their own goals. Sometimes they're personal deficits. These are things that would be um, problematic, such as mental health issues, such as substance abuse disorder issues. If they still are fighting cravings related to addiction issues, they're more likely than not to reoffend and find themselves back in place. Economic deficits. No one's walking out of prison a rich man. There are always going to be bills to pay. They're always going to walk out the door feeling as though they're in the hole and have to find a job to dig their way out. That leads to a lack of employment. How many job applications have you ever seen where the question was asked, "Are you a convicted felon?" printed on those um, job application forms? It's difficult for convicts to find a suitable wage paying job immediately upon release. There's also family deficits. We've talked about long serving officers dealing with generations of criminals all within the same family. I can attest to having arrested a grandfather, a father, and a son. If all of these family members have also spent time in prison, it's more likely than not that they view that as normal and not abnormal. Um, if the family is dysfunctional or is not supportive of that inmate who's been released, it's going to make things that much more difficult as well. This was the last section into our module related to corrections. There were 2 chapters to deal with this week. I know that's a little bit of extra writing or extra reading. However, your discussion post only focuses on chapter 14. The quiz will focus on all 3 chapters. So it's imperative that you have taken the time to read all 3. I look forward to seeing that work come in, and we will be moving on into the final module of our class.